All right. So, well, Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you for coming on Based Podcast here in Canberra, live from Canberra. Not live, but we're live. No one else is live at the moment. But it's great to have you here. You're in Australia for how long? You're travelling around promoting a movie, Whose Land, I think. So how long are you here?
Yeah, I've been here just over a week now, and I've got just over another week, so it'll be nearly 3 weeks before I leave, which is always too short a time to spend in Australia, but it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to join your podcast.
Thank you. It's a big country. It's travel gets you around. It's hard work. So, but you've been to Melbourne and Sydney so far, now to Canberra, and where else are you headed after this for the?
After this, we're going back to Sydney.
Yep.
I'm working with the AJA, the American Jewish Association, which is one of the more prominent Jewish bodies in Australia.
Right.
And we're visiting Canberra. I'm talking at a couple of high schools and a couple of synagogues and doing other events in Sydney. You,
of course, you are a military person, as I gave away with the title Colonel. You retired since 2006, but you really started your career during the Northern Ireland, during the Troubles. As a sort of young person growing up, I watched that, I think, with a degree of confusion as to what was going on, but it must have been an incredible time. What are your reflections of that period?
Well, I left school one day, high school, and I joined the army the next day at the age of 17. And my first operational tour of duty was in Northern Ireland, and I did another 8 tours of duty after that in Northern Ireland, in various different parts of the country. And what was going on there effectively was a form of insurgency led by the Provisional IRA, which was trying to using violence, trying to break Northern Ireland away from the United Kingdom. It was a pretty tough fight. There was many different parties involved, led to a large extent by the police, with the British Army backing them up, particularly in the rural areas around the border with Southern Ireland. And it was a tough time. There were some very, very difficult incidents and events that occurred there. And essentially the British Army was doing everything it could to prevent the country descending into civil war, which was very much a possibility. And so British soldiers risked their lives on a daily basis. Many of them gave up their lives to prevent a civil war from breaking out and to deal with the terrorist situation. But today, after what was called the Good Friday Agreement a number of years ago, when the terrorist groups agreed to lay down their arms, today the political element of the IRA, called Sinn Féin, is now trying to rewrite history, to paint its terrorists as freedom fighters and to paint British troops as the terrorists. And that's gained a lot of political traction in the world today.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because I think people don't always understand how violent it was. It was a sort of an early precursor to some of the sorts of things we see now in the Middle East. But do you think the prospects there of that peace holding are strong, or are there the prospects of it reigniting?
I think there's every likelihood it could reignite at some point in the future. There are already dissident terrorist groups, kind of like offshoot splinter groups from the IRA who attempt terrorist attacks on a regular and frequent basis, with very little success, but the effort is still there to try and reignite this terrorist campaign. You mentioned the Middle East as well, and one thing that a lot of people aren't aware of.
Please go on. This happens occasionally. Sorry, so go on. We were probably sorry. So you were saying about Northern Ireland?
You mentioned the Middle East,
yeah.
and this being a sort of almost a precursor of some of the terrorism in the Middle East. One thing a lot of people don't realise is that the IRA, the Irish terrorists, were very closely associated with Palestinian terrorists, right, as well as with Gaddafi and his Libyan jihadist regime in that country. And not only did the Israelis help us to counter the IRA Palestinian terrorist links, but they were directly involved in some of the major successful operations against terrorism, such as an operation in Gibraltar, in which a group of terrorists were trying to blow up British soldiers in Gibraltar, and Israeli intelligence played a key role in trying to stop that.
And I assume that a lot of the operations in Northern Ireland around those areas have informed British military doctrine after the event. A lot of it was sort of fighting in urban areas against a terrorist organisation. So that must have informed what you saw later on in the Middle East when you went to places like Fallujah and Mosul and places like that? I mean, was there a lot of similarities?
Yeah, some similarities. The British Army gained, I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but the British Army gained a great deal of experience fighting terrorism, which it was then able to bring into action later on. But I think one of the big mistakes we made, I mean, they do say the British always fight the last war. And I think, you know, certainly in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, there were too many people trying to apply the Northern Ireland template to that war. Right. And it really had some similarities, but mostly it was very different.
Yeah, or a different theatre. Of course, then from there you moved on with that experience to the Gulf War, and I think you were involved heavily in the early stages of that. Of course, it was a fairly brief conflict, but I mean that's one of my sort of early memories of, you know, this kind of new wave of warfare. What was that like, going to the Gulf in 1990, I think it was, at the end of?
Yeah, we went in 1990, and we went into Iraq in 1991.
Yeah.
And the Americans and the coalition, including the British, built up massive forces, an enormous armoured force and air forces, etc., to eradicate Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. And it was I wouldn't say it was quite like a turkey shoot, but it wasn't a fair fight, quite rightly, because fights aren't supposed to be fair. But it was relatively easy to overcome Saddam's forces with such massive Western troops.
They were calling it the 100-day war at that stage, and it was almost literally 3 months, wasn't it? It was sort of beginning to end. But you just to get an idea of that operational involvement, you were stationed in Saudi Arabia, presumably, or how did you actually enter the theatre, and what was that like?
I was actually, the unit I was with, which was 7th Armoured Brigade, was based in Germany. We went from Germany to Saudi. We then spent about 4 or 5 months training and preparing in Saudi Arabia before then advancing into Iraq from Saudi Arabia with United States forces.
And it was over very quickly, of course. It was done and dusted.
It was very quick. And, you know, for example, we had tank battles in which I was in a tank during that war. Mm-hmm. I'm an infantryman by breeding, but I spent that war in a tank. Mm-hmm. I won't bore you with the detail. But we were firing very, very precise tank shells over ranges of about 3,000 metres using thermal imaging equipment, which could operate very effectively even in sandstorms, which were quite a few of them, against Russian tanks that were being used by the Iraqis, quite old tanks, which had a range of about 1,000 or so metres.
So these were, these were like probably not even as advanced as T-72s. They were sort of well before that, T-50s.
Very old tanks.
Yeah, incredible. Amazing time. You then went to become the commander of Operation Fingal in Afghanistan. So that was in 2003. And your military career, sort of, you're moving into the sort of genuine operational commander level, 300 men under your command. Early stages of Afghanistan. I mean, you're right there in the early stages of these operations. Like, there must be, I don't know, a mixture of chaotic and precise. Like, what is it like to go into Afghanistan in 2003 with the Taliban?
Yeah, I mean, it was relatively low intensity conflict compared to later when the British Armed Forces were in Helmand and other places. There was some terrorist activity, mainly Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda related groups that were carrying out attacks against our forces in Kabul. We were based mainly in Kabul. Yeah. A lot of the work involved also disarming local warlords, trying to integrate them into a new government, train them into new government forces, train them, and also there were things like, you know, the odd unusual event, like there was an attempted coup d'etat against President Karzai during the time I was there, which our forces were involved in preventing.
And what about, I just get your thoughts on the exit with, you know, the Biden administration leaving $80 billion worth of equipment. I mean, for somebody that fought in that theatre, what are your reflections on that? It must be disappointing.
It was a catastrophe, I think, nothing less than that. The operation in Afghanistan went on too long, and it probably didn't need to go on for that length of time, but it was probably badly judged. It wasn't wrong to go in there. I think it was the right thing to go in there, but to try and put so much effort into turning Afghanistan into a democracy, which clearly was never going to work, was, I think, a mistake. But it did succeed, that operation did succeed in preventing another 9/11. Of course, 9/11 emerged from Afghanistan. There was no similar type of attack from Afghanistan during that period, which was the major aim of that operation. Having said that, when we left, immediately everything that had been set up, the army, the government, it just collapsed.
Evaporated, yeah.
Yeah, and so that was, that was a catastrophe which, in my view, led directly. It kind of showed US and NATO weakness, and led directly to Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
And what's happened to those weapons, do you suspect now? It's very high. I know there are organisations that track weapons that go missing or they're traded on the black market, but I mean, would they still be in the hands of the Taliban? Would they have been sold? Would it be a combination of the above?
I think a combination of a number of things. I'm sure many of them found their way to Iran and went from there to, because of course the Taliban and Iran are quite closely linked, and Iran supported and assisted the Taliban in attacks against Western forces in Afghanistan during that entire period. So some of them will have gone there to a range of different places.
Yeah, just on the market. Iraq as well, in another theatre, before we sort of broaden the discussion a bit. But you went to Iraq. You made a number of visits to Baghdad, presumably in the early days, which must have been something else, but also to Fallujah and Mosul as well. So I'm particularly interested in Fallujah because that is probably one of the most important combat operations of the last 50 years, I suppose. I don't think it's not talked about a lot, but what was your involvement with that and what was it like?
I wasn't actually involved in the fighting in Fallujah. I was there during some of the fighting, but my role was intelligence. I was working with the CIA over that period, looking at the sort of wider, broader intelligence picture. But what I did observe was a very effective battle by the Americans, which achieved its aim to a very large extent. But there was a lot of damage done, a lot of casualties on both sides, and a lot of civilian casualties as well, which people tend to forget about that when they're kind of looking at the current situation in Gaza, where there's so much criticism of Israel for inflicting civilian casualties, forgetting that it's impossible to do otherwise in any battle like that, like Fallujah or Mosul or any of the others.
Well, it's sort of the point, isn't it? Combat in an urban environment people don't understand. I don't understand because I've never been there, but I can at least accept that it's very difficult. The stats that have been talked about, the current conflict in Gaza, talk about an almost incredible low level of civilian casualties in the grand scheme of things, and you compare that to the American numbers in Iraq, quite significantly higher. What do they look like? Do you know exactly what the stats look like in that comparison? How do they compare it, and how come? Why are they so much lower in Gaza?
The first thing to say is it's very, very difficult to make a really accurate analysis of these sort of statistics during a war. It'll become a bit clearer after the war's finished. But if we let's go on the statistics for civilian casualties that Hamas say that have been inflicted, which we can't rely on, but we have nothing else. So take their statistics and then take away from what they're saying, which is about 21,700 is their latest estimate of total casualties in Gaza. Take away from that the 15,000 or thereabouts terrorist deaths that have been inflicted by the IDF according to their estimates, and it gives you a ratio of about 0.8 to 1. Civilian to military, civilian to terrorist casualties. Sounds terrible, and it is terrible, because it's terrible when civilians die in war. But if you compare it to Iraq and Afghanistan, in both of those theatres, casualties inflicted by the Americans were 5 to 1 in Afghanistan and 3 to 1 in Iraq. So that shows a really big difference between the civilian casualty rates in those countries and in Gaza. And the way the Israelis do it is because they've developed the most sophisticated mechanism for mitigating civilian harm in Gaza, and huge amounts of effort have gone in. Just as an example, they've dropped something like 7 million leaflets on Gaza telling people to get out of certain areas, where to go for better safety. They've made hundreds of thousands of phone calls, voice messages, text messages, numerous other means to try and prevent the civilian
roof knockers,
deaths.
the roof knocking.
Right.
So tell me about that, because that's fascinating.
So that's an innovation of Israel, which is essentially dropping by aircraft an explosive on top of a building, which doesn't cause damage but makes a very loud noise, and it's kind of like the final stage in encouraging people to leave a building. And again, then once that's been done, and once other warnings have been given, the IDF maintain surveillance in the area with drones and other means to let them know when civilians have left. And only once they calculate that all the civilians have left a building will they then destroy that building.
And I mean, of course, overlaid onto that is the difficulty you have in fighting a terrorist organisation that, for starters, hide in hospitals, hide in schools, hide in civilian buildings, hide munitions in those areas as well. But also, we know, actively try to discourage people from leaving those areas because they are cover, which, by the way, is actually a war crime.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm staggered that these are things that aren't more well known. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I mean, I believe that to be correct. I mean, who knows what you see on social media, but there is long-standing reports of Hamas using their civilians as human shields.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes even beyond that. Hamas have a deliberate policy which they've used over many years, and they have admitted to, of trying to encourage the IDF to kill Gazan civilians. It's the only army in history that I know of that wanted its enemy to kill its own civilian population. And that's what they organise their operations and their attacks to achieve just that. And that does include stopping civilians from leaving when they've been warned to go, as you rightly say, including killing some of them as a deterrent to others to stop them leaving. It's part of their strategy. And the reason they have that strategy of trying to get their own civilians killed is because it achieves exactly what we're seeing now, which is international pressure on Israel as a result of false accusations of indiscriminate killing, because that's about the only way they can stop Israel from destroying them, by international pressure to prevent Israel finishing them off.
And so, I mean, this is the difficulty because, of course, that percolates. The media, will run with it, and, of course, the media's diverse. There are lots of different views. I mean, this may be out of scope, but what's your view on why it is that movement has become so militarised against Israel in terms of the international community and this sort of wave of anti-Semitism that's come through, particularly aimed at this operation over anything else? I mean, it feels like it's reached fever pitch, and the IDF that I know, that I have read for a long time about and have studied, would never do the things they are saying. It's very confusing for people, I think.
Yeah, I mean, of course, mistakes happen in war, and we saw with the World Central Kitchen, the IDF attacking aid workers by mistake. Mistakes do happen all the time. It's such a confusing environment. So there's undoubtedly been people killed who shouldn't have been killed. But what we're looking at now in the media is the product of decades and decades and decades of propaganda against Israel. It started in the 1960s. It began in the Soviet Union, actually, trying to use Israel as a weapon against American and US and British influence in the Middle East. And it's built up from there. And the narrative is Israel's an illegitimate country. Israel has illegal settlements, illegal occupation. They commit genocide. They carry out, they have an apartheid policy, all of which are absolute lies. But that has basically produced a condition whereby it's very easy for people to attack Israel in the media. And anything that happens to Israel, including the 7th of October, Israel had it coming. Anything Israel does in its defence, it's wrong. And just on the genocide point, genocide has been a big feature of this latest genocide accusations. Yeah. I was here in Australia, I think it was about 2018, I did a talk at the University of Sydney. And during that, I was accused of supporting genocide then because I supported Israel. So it's not a new thing. This is this phenomenon has developed very, very effectively over many years.
It's a product almost of the long march through the institutions, isn't it? I talk about it all the time, I'm sure you do as well, where children have been brainwashed at schools, then through universities, and now are into the corporate sector. They're now the captains of industry, these people who are sharing this worldview. I say we're on a long march back the opposite way. So we've got to get people the right information, which is what we hopefully do with this in some small capacity. I just want to talk a little bit about this specific conflict. October 7, some of the most horrific stuff you could ever see in what happened to the people of Israel on that day, which now, of course, in this cacophony we've been talking about, appears to just getting drowned out by many of the commentators said that would happen, and of course it has. I'm interested to know, with your intelligence and military background, how it is we explain October the 7th from the point of view of it sneaking up on the biggest dragnet of intelligence services possibly in the world, and then the response time as well from such a professional army. I'd just be interested to have you just address that, so for my own benefit, apart from anything else.
Yeah, I mean, it was a catastrophic failure on the part of Israel. As you say, Israeli intelligence is world renowned for being one of the most effective intelligence services in the world. They were deceived by Hamas and Iran. There was a very, very sophisticated deception operation which made the Israelis believe that Hamas did not have any aggressive intention towards them at the moment. They were focused on the reconstruction and the development of Gaza. And the Israelis genuinely believed that. I was briefed that that was the case during visits and briefings on intelligence in Israel before the 7th of October. They believed it. And then when signs emerged of, of attack planning, attack preparations, the Israelis just didn't believe them. They thought it was something else. And so they allowed themselves to be caught off guard. They thinned out the defences along the Gaza border because they didn't expect an attack.
Can I just stop you there, though? Just to play devil's advocate, even if you thought that there was just training exercise going on in that sort of environment, which we know is hostile. I mean, I've been to the area. Wouldn't you just be ready anyway?
Yes, you would be ready anyway. And I'm sure the investigation that Israel is launching into this will conclude that, as I certainly conclude, that if there is a threat, even if there's a capability there to carry out damage against you, and you don't think they have the willpower, you still have to defend against that threat because like you might be wrong.
Having someone outside your window walking around with a screwdriver, and you say, "Well, he doesn't look like he's about to come in." I mean, anyway, it's a very difficult environment. And what about the response time? So it happens. Am I right in saying it was sort of almost 6 hours before the response? We're talking about small distances. From a military point of view, what happened?
Very significant failure of response, and partly due to the fact that there was a holiday in Israel, a religious holiday in Israel at the time. Many IDF units were stood down, personnel were at home on leave, which again, was undoubtedly
and has happened before. Yom Kippur,
exactly,
right.
Has happened before, and was almost predictable.
Yeah.
So that was one element. Another element was the fact that the command and control capabilities, some of the camera systems, the communication systems, were taken out very effectively by Hamas at an early stage. So that really hampered their ability to understand what was happening and summon reinforcements. But one point I would make, that was another catastrophic failure. But one point I would make, and I've met many of them, there was some incredible heroism on that day by individuals who got a phone call, something bad is going on, they got in their car, they got their weapon, they drove down and they fought individually or in small groups inside some of the kibbutzes that were under siege. And that is, it doesn't mitigate the horrors that happened and the mistakes, but it is certainly incredible acts of bravery that we saw there that day.
Well, it shows the importance of individuals taking responsibility for their own security, doesn't it, in a sense? And we see that time and time again. Just in terms of where to from here over there, we know that there were many hostages. Some tragically have died. Some tragically are still there, which another thing that gets forgotten by the international community in this whole business. But 50 or so, 56, I think, were still unaccounted for and presumably somewhere in Gaza. It's awful to talk about, but what do you see for them? And I mean, are they going to be alive? Some of them are probably not, sadly. And how do they get them out?
Yeah, well, there's been absolute horror stories of abuse, sexual assault, etc., against some of the hostages that have been held in Gaza. I'm sure many of them that are still there are probably no longer alive. I hope many of them are still alive. I think it's very difficult to get them out through military means. I was involved myself in hostage rescue operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The two critical elements: one, you've got to have very precise intelligence to target forces to deal with it. Not easy to do. Secondly, you've got to have the element of surprise. If you don't have that, the hostage is going to be dead, and probably your soldiers as well. So that makes a rescue operation hard, very hard. The only possibility, I think, of getting them out is by continuing to apply military pressure against Hamas, which may force them to agreeing to some kind of release deal. But I'm certain, unfortunately, that they will do their best to hold on to as many of those hostages as they can to act as human shields, if nothing else, for their senior commanders and also as further bargaining chips.
And the tunnel system has complicated this dramatically. I mean, it's an incredible network. Presumably the hostages are there, more than likely than not, those that are still there. And I mean, operationally, as you say, almost impossible to get people out of that environment. And yeah, I mean, but yeah, but at least I suppose there's some certainty as to where they are. I don't know. I suppose presumably around the areas of Rafah now.
I don't know, and I don't know if the IDF have got a very good idea. They've probably got some idea of where they are. But I've been into those tunnels myself underneath Gaza, and they are the most incredible constructions, paid for, of course, by our money. But they include things in some cases like very heavy blast walls, blast doors to compartmentalise the tunnel, camera systems, the strongest defences you could fight against. But having said that, the IDF, who originally were not going to fight in the tunnels when the war began, their policy was just to destroy tunnels from above ground. They've also been doing some very, very effective operations in those tunnels with using some very innovative techniques, and they've killed a lot of terrorists in the tunnels.
Terrible place to operate. It's shocking. Yeah. On the subject of those tunnels, the thing that's puzzling for me is this stuff, the materials that have been used, the electronics, the light bulbs, the munitions, are presumably coming in under the Egyptian border. But it must have taken years to... These are not insignificant tunnels. They're not, tiny little rat holes. Some of them are enough to get a vehicle down.
Yeah.
How do they do that? I mean, how does that happen?
You can be sure that it's taken decades to build this tunnel system, and a lot of people, including children, have been killed constructing tunnels. You get paid a premium and you take big risks for doing that, but they've been progressively working on it, as you say, sometimes using material being illicitly brought in from Egypt, sometimes using material that's legitimately been brought in from Israel to help construct the tunnels. But it's an incredible feat of engineering. One thing people ask is, where's all the spoil? Where's all the heaps of spoil that have been taken out of the ground? And the answer to that is there are many different ways of concealing spoil, but one of which is that there are houses inside Gaza which are just full of earth. The tunnels have been excavated and filled, sometimes multi-storey houses with earth.
Just to cover it up?
Yeah.
Incredible.
They're still there.
Human ingenuity is an amazing thing in war. It's the mother of all invention. Just on the subject of the military, I think you made some comments about the diversity in the United Kingdom military and the diversity and inclusion, movement. I have I suppose spent a bit of time here with our various agencies asking questions about diversity and inclusion. When people are to do one job, but they seem to spend their time chasing diversity targets. How far has that spread in the United Kingdom? Do you get a feel for how far it might have spread in the Australian military as well? Or would we be following in suit with those sorts of, diversity targets? I mean, does it really matter, or do we just need good soldiers?
I think this whole diversity, equality agenda has seized and infected the whole of government in the UK, and that does include the armed forces. And I have no doubt that if Australia is not up there with us now, it will join us very soon in this sickness. Of course, armed forces are supposed to reflect the makeup of society. And generally speaking, they do, broadly speaking. But the most important thing is not to have an exact mix of gender, of racial, ethnicity, whatever. That's not the most important thing. It has some importance, but the most important thing is to have the right people doing the right job in the armed forces. And unfortunately, in the British forces, we're seeing a real crisis of recruitment. There are many reasons for that, but one of those reasons is the disaffectation of serving soldiers or people with a desire to join by this entire agenda. And when you have recruitment adverts which really emphasise, these totally unrelated and bizarre agendas, that doesn't encourage people to join. The best recruiting, the best advertising for recruiting in the British forces was when Afghanistan and Iraq were at their height, and people saw on their television people leading a life of action, danger, which attracted them. The diversity agenda does not attract most people of the sort who want to join the army.
It seems to be common. The United States seem to be having recruitment problems as well, and I think here as well, similar sort of reasons. Is there any hope that's going to be a fad and it's going to get washed out, do you think? Or is it?
I would hope so, but that is purely a hope. I've got no kind of anything really to base it on, but I think in the case of Britain, I suspect it's just going to get worse, because we almost certainly have got a Labour government coming into power at the next general election. And that government is far stronger on these agendas than the current supposedly conservative government we have now.
And what about day-to-day life now for you? You're involved in some charitable work, and you're doing these sorts of tours and visiting other countries. It's fascinating stuff. But do you have any sort of long-term concerns about the sort of work you've done before? I know it was reported you're on an Al-Qaeda hit list at one point. Is that a real concern for you, like getting around in this environment?
It was one of my proudest achievements in my life to be found on a Al-Qaeda kill list in Syria, because of course it showed that I was having some kind of impact on people that I wanted to have.
You were over the target.
Right. But I spend, since the 9th of October, I've been almost constantly in Israel. Before that, I was in Ukraine. I've visited the front lines in Ukraine a few times as well. And to me, this is not so much, it's not just about Ukraine, it's not just about Israel. It's their fights, and I would say particularly Israel's fight, but also Ukraine's fight. Their fights for Western civilization, their fights for our democratic values, which these people, in many cases, are absolutely opposed to. And when you see protests on university campuses here in Australia and Britain, in the US and other countries, attacking Israel, supporting Hamas, these people, you scratch the surface, they're anti-Australian, they're anti-American, they're anti-British. And therefore, I believe we have a duty to stand up and fight them, whether it's in the media, wherever it is, politically, to stand up and fight them, not just for Israel, but for our own Western values.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting period, and I hope you're enjoying Australia and enjoying Parliament House as well. We've come here during Budget Week, the swampiest week of all, so hopefully it doesn't leave a sour taste in your mouth, but you enjoy the trip and enjoy the tour, and thanks for having a chat.
Thank you very much for having me. I always enjoy being in Australia. And my great-grandfather came from Rockhampton, so I consider myself partly Australian.
There you go. Great connection. Thanks again. Thanks, Richard.